China slammed the U.S.'s so-called Uygur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019, saying it deliberately smears China's counter-terrorism and de-radicalization efforts. What's really driving the U.S. to push the bill, and what ramifications will there be? And NATO is celebrating its 70th year at a meeting in London this week, but major growing pains are gripping the 29-member group. What's threatening the bloc's unity, and why does it matter to China? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. China made 8 strong-worded statements against the U.S. on Wednesday after the U.S. House of Representatives passed the so-called Uygur Human Rights Policy Act of 2019. This is a stronger version of a bill passed in the Senate in September. Now it has been passed by 407 versus 1 in the Democratic-controlled House. And if the act is approved by the Republican-controlled Senate, it will be sent to the U.S. President Donald Trump to sign into law. China condemns the act for maliciously attacking the human rights conditions in Xinjiang, slandering China's de-radicalization and anti-terrorism efforts, making groundless accusations against the Chinese government's Xinjiang policies, and grossly interfering in China's internal affairs. China warned there will be further reactions according to the development of the situation. First Hong Kong, now Xinjiang. Why is the U.S. getting ever more involved in China's domestic affairs? How can China act effectively? Joining me for the discussion in the studio are Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, and Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. I do want to highlight the kind of background against which China has decided to take effective measures against terrorism in Xinjiang. According to some information released for the first time, as we have seen on documentaries that have been aired by CGTN. There have been thousands of terrorist attacks in Xinjiang from the 1990s up to 2016. Some of them include, for instance, the February 5th in 1997 in the Yining terror attacks, where 7 people, civilians, were killed and 198 wounded. On July the 5th, 2009, and Urumqi riots, where 197 civilians dead, 1,700 wounded. On July the 30th, 2011, in Kashgar, 6 civilians killed. In 2013, in a place called Serik Buya, where 15 civilians were killed, 2 wounded. In March the 1st, 2014, in Kunming, Yunnan province, terrorists from Xinjiang killed 31 civilians, wounding 141 innocent people. In May 2014, 39 people were killed in the morning market in Urumqi, 94 people wounded. And on October the 18th, 2003, there was a violent terrorist attack in Tiananmen, where people drove a car and rammed into part of the structure in front of the Tiananmen Square, killing 2 innocent people and wounding 40 others, and the list goes on. Victor, how severe exactly was the situation?
Well, there is no denying that up to about more than 2 years ago in Xinjiang in particular, but also in other parts of China, there were very rampant terrorist attacks. Now, these terrorist attacks had several characteristics. First, most of these terrorists were Uyghurs. And secondly, this form of terrorism is very much commingled with the separatism demanding that Xinjiang be recognized as an independent country. And this is very much related to certain extreme elements calling Xinjiang East Turkmenistan. So this is extremely lethal and dangerous, and it held many Chinese people hostage and put the Chinese people in fear. Therefore, I think the government has to take responsible actions to deal with this extremism, terrorism, and separatism. Why? Because people in China, 1.4 billion of them, do not want to live in fear, do not want to live in the shadow of terrorism.
Especially the people in Xinjiang, no matter Uyghurs or Kazakhs or any other nationality, and not the Huns, I believe nobody wants to live in this kind of shadow. But Einar, do you think these incidents are known to the American people, to the American politicians? Do you think, and as we have seen, these are not made-up stories. There are videos, surveillance camera footages showing these things actually happened, and yet it seems that is totally gone unnoticed.
Well, that's not unusual in the United States. I mean, there are people being killed by terrorism and extremism around the world. When it comes home within the United States, it hits the headlines, and it's, you know, it's really worked over quite a bit in the press. But outside, no. And so you have this situation where people in the U.S. just have been sold the story that these peaceful Uyghurs are just being maliciously tortured and oppressed by the Chinese government because they have nothing better to do. You know, the irony here, though, is that, you know, the U.S., who has caused a lot of this destabilization in the Middle East, all right, now refuses to take in any of these people. You know, Donald Trump has said he doesn't even want the Syrians to come in, although he says he wants to help them. So there's a real line. And the same thing in Europe. All of these parties are now saying that they don't want to have these refugees coming in, especially Islamic refugees. So there's more than a little bit of hypocrisy as they go about doing this.
Yeah, let me just highlight this sentence, for instance, from the Act itself, and it says the Act is depicted to condemn gross human rights violations of ethnic Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang and call for an end and harassment of these communities inside and outside China. It also talks about China has been systematically discriminating against Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs and other Muslims in Xinjiang. It seems that this Act is standing up for the rights of the Uyghur people, for instance, and the Muslim communities in Xinjiang. Is it really what it's supposed to, what it wants to do?
First of all, I think these expressions are completely falsified fabrications. Why? I can put it on for the record that there is no greater friend of Islam than China. And there is no greater friend of the Muslim people than the Chinese people. This is a fact. Look around. China has never fought a battle against any Muslim country or Islamic people, for example. China is the greatest friend of the Pakistani people. China has been doing good things in many Arab countries. And China is the steadfast friend of Palestine, for example. Name any other country who can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the people of the world a greater commitment to the Islamic cause or the Muslim cause than the Chinese government and the Chinese people. So this is completely
I don't know about
false.
that, but I mean, 30 out of the 60 countries that signed on to a UN resolution supporting China's efforts to de-radicalize and deal with this terrorism threat were in fact members of the United Islamic Organization.
Cooperation.
So, cooperation. Yeah. So it would, if in fact this was anti-Islamic, I think they would be speaking out. Now, the other people are saying, oh, they're just afraid of China. I don't think that is in fact the case.
So exactly what's behind it? I mean, obviously this is proposed by a China hawk. Very, very clear in that factor, and yet it has been passed by such a wide margin. I mean, 407
but you have to understand
Did these
why.
people, yeah, I wonder why.
The reason is because, look, Donald Trump made it very clear that he wanted to portray the Democrats as being soft on China, being soft on all these things. The Democrats have their own tendencies towards emphasizing human rights. So they're not going to put up a fight. That's why these things are passing, you know, by a majority to 1. And in the Senate, they'll probably have another voice call where it'll be passed unanimously.
That's very irresponsible in my eyes.
It's not a question. You're mistaking politics for policy. And in this particular case,
shouldn't the laws in the United States be?
But it shouldn't be. But when you're dealing with a democracy, it's about the next election. And everything that we're seeing rolling out here today, with Donald Trump and everything else, and these attacks on China, whether it's in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan, or Tibet, is all about politics.
Victor?
I think the Congress has a mandate to pass laws which will serve the fundamental interests of the American people. But recently, for example, the Hong Kong-related law and this act about Xinjiang and Uyghurs, for example, are not going to serve the fundamental interests of the American people at all. If there are more terrorist attacks in China, the American people will suffer. If Hong Kong falls apart...
Why? Because they would say, if something happens in China, why would the American people suffer?
Listen.
Yes.
Listen, there are Uyghur fighters fighting the American troops in Afghanistan, fighting against NATO troops in Afghanistan. They may have American blood on their hand. Where did these Uyghur fighters come from? Of course they came from China's Xinjiang province. They were radicalized. They want to fight against the American troops. So if terrorism prevailed in China, the American interests in Afghanistan, in Central Asia, in other parts of the world will suffer. So we should be in the same trench, fighting against terrorism together, of all colors and shapes and
this bill is obviously not doing that.
No, it's not.
But it's not aimed at that. I keep saying, do not mistake politics for policy. I mean, this is a democracy. We look at the next elections.
What's the consequence of mixing policy with politics? That's
what you're having is a threatened global slowdown in trade. You have a president and an administration who's bent on blending security with trade, with all of these different things, just in order to look good. And this is the problem. Now, you can't change that.
And they don't think about any potential consequence of China's reaction.
Let's be
because China has been very, very angry with what they did to Hong Kong. Yes, go ahead.
All right. India, the fundamental function of a government is to allow the people to be safe in their homes, on the street, everywhere.
Yes.
In the United States, when the government has said, we cannot protect you, buy a gun. All right?
So they want China to do that too?
No, my point is that when you start looking at China, they take this very seriously. The role of the government is to keep the people safe in their homes, on the street, in their places of work, and where they go to school. This is not something that can be tampered with. The Chinese government is not going to say, well, we can't do it, here's a gun. Right? They have that responsibility, and that is the basic responsibility of government. If you say you can't do that, you have failed the first test of government.
And the Chinese government seems to have chosen to do it in a very different way. Not you fight your own wars or taking up your own arms, or not through any other way, but rather through education and preventing. That's my understanding. Victor?
Absolutely. I think these three strands are combined together: terrorism, separatism, and extremism. Now, among the Uyghurs in particular, and among other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, the rise of extremism is horrifying. And, for example, there have been many, many cases where some families will prevent their kids from going to public schools or denying their girls the right to education. Why? Because they were radicalized to believe that if you send your kid to school, their Uyghur heritage will be taken away. They will be forced to study Han Chinese, for example. No, I think this is completely wrong, because
it's against the law. There's a compulsory education.
Absolutely. There is a compulsory education law. No one has the right to deprive the kids of the right to education. Secondly, no one in the world can destroy the Uyghur culture or can damage the Islamic culture, because we in China all support Islam. We love the Muslims. We are brothers and sisters with the Muslim brothers and sisters. So to insinuate that there is a trend in China to eliminate the Muslim culture or the Islamic culture is an attack on Muslim itself, is an insult to Islam itself. So I think this law is fundamentally and philosophically misplaced in the starting point to talk about.
Well, I think Xinjiang, as I understand, is open for tourists from domestic and from Chinese, other parts of China, and from abroad. So anybody who would like to...
123 million tourists through the first 10 months of this year have visited Xinjiang. The amount of foreign trade has gone up by 28%.
Yeah.
The economy is booming. There have been no more terrorist attacks.
Now, the point I want to make is maybe people should go and see for themselves whether the Uyghur language and culture is being threatened, whether the Chinese government does not support people's rights to practice the Islam if they choose to. But we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Victor Gao and Einar Tangen.